We have to acknowledge that we don't fully access the physical reality.
These are metaphors that have gone crazy.
This seems like a very historical debate.
Nature cannot violate the laws of God.
Why not? The laws of physics as something that constrains or even causes the world around us is as fundamental a concept as anything. That's what I investigate on this channel. However, do laws like this even exist in this manner? Do what we call the, quote, laws of physics actually compel reality? Or do they describe patterns that we observe? Professor Barry Loewer of Rutgers University champions the Humean view that laws are sophisticated summaries, not these primitive governing forces. Professor Chen of UC San Diego defends the opposing position through minimal primitivism. That is, that laws are fundamental metaphysical facts that genuinely constrain physical possibilities. A special thank you to Barry as he had just come off of a 12-hour flight. You'll notice the playful camaraderie between these two, and that's because Barry, along with David Albert, were Eddy Chen's PhD supervisors. Stick around until the end as we get to questions of free will and ultimately whether the mathematical structures physicists discover reflect mind-independent features of nature or are projections of human pattern seeking onto brute facts. To me, the stakes extend beyond academic philosophy. It's about how we understand the laws that shape our conception of science, causation, and you, yes you, your place in the universe. I'd like to talk about a phrase that we use often, and it's so often that it's become second nature to us all. What is it that we mean when we say the laws of physics? Laws. So this channel's called Theories of Everything. We explore various unification attempts and laws of physics, but we don't talk about, well, what is a law? And what is its role in ontology and causation? So I know you all have different views on this. Various technical jargon will come out, like Humeanism and primitivism and so on. Get mentaculous if we get to that as well. Best systems, etc. Those will all be defined. But for now, as an introduction for the audience, you have different stances on the place of the wave function regarding ontology and or its place in the laws of physics. So let's tease those out. And let's start with Eddy, please. How do you see it? And then we'll hear from Barry.
So for me, laws of nature are fundamental facts. They just govern the universe. They are not part of something else. They are not, reduced to what goes on in the universe. So laws of nature, in some sense, and laws of physics are something like laws of mathematics and laws of logic. They just be and govern. They constrain, they explain. And laws of physics have less robustness than laws of mathematics and laws of logic, but they're still part of the fundamental goings-on of the universe. And in that sense, they are primitive facts. There are facts that exist in the world. They don't depend on anything else. And one crucial element of this governing business is that laws constrain what's physically possible. So there is the actual world, the universe we live in, the universe in which, the Big Bang happens, and here's us, and there's the maybe Big Crunch, and there's all that goes on in the universe. And laws of nature constrain the possibilities for this universe. So what could have been the case? The counterfactuals, the possibilities and necessities. So laws governs the universe by allowing certain possibilities to unfold, and certain possibilities to not be the actual world. And the actual world is one element of the many possibilities allowed by the laws of nature.
Okay, Barry, why don't you spell out your view on what laws are?
Okay. Well, first thing I want to say is that much of what Eddy said, I can agree with, at least those words, but I think that would mean a little bit different things. Many of those words, but I can agree that laws constrain under a certain understanding of constraint. I agree that they support counterfactuals. I have a whole theory of counterfactuals. Maybe we'll want to get to it and so on. So I agree with the words, but there's something I don't agree with. I don't agree that laws are what Eddy called primitive facts. Now, I'm not exactly sure what primitive facts are, so I think it's useful to go back with a little history. Do you mind that?
Sure.
You do mind it?
No, please do.
Okay. I think it's very interesting to think about the history of the concept of laws. First, most interesting thing is no one has written a history of the concept of laws of nature. There's one book that kind of comes a little bit close, but nobody has really done it. If I were a historian, I would think that that's, right, we're just right on the tree, ready to be plucked off. People have written histories of probability and chance, a closely related notion. No one's written a history of the concept of law. So the concept of law, in the modern sense, really has a father. I want to ask you to guess who the father was. It is Father's Day today, isn't it?
Oh, okay.
Well, maybe we should celebrate this guy.
All right.
He's a pretty famous French philosopher. I bet you know who I'm talking about.
Rousseau?
No, come on. He was interested in breaking the laws, not much more famous than Rousseau. The most famous one, the one that
Descartes?
If you go into Paris, you walk down Rue Descartes. Okay, Descartes. So Descartes was the father, really. I mean, this is a little bit of an exaggeration, but the father of the modern concept of laws of nature. He had a vision. His vision was that there could be a few principles that can be expressed in mathematics, which are not primitive facts at all. What they do is they describe how God moves matter around. Descartes had the view that all activity in the universe was due to God. So Descartes had this view that what the laws were they described how God moves things around. It was God who did the constraining, God who did the enforcing, God who moved things around. So they described how God constrains things, but they weren't primitive facts. They described what God was doing. They had two important features. One was what Eddy was calling the constraining, or what's usually called the governing feature. And the other was the unifying feature. They unified all of nature. And of course, they're also mathematical. And you know why Descartes knew that the laws had to be mathematical? Because he thought God must be a mathematician. Because he was a mathematician. Okay, this is the history. Really, honestly, the history of when the notion of law originated. And the people who've written about it, I can give some references, scholars. A guy named Peter Harrison, another person named John Milton, not the poet, another one. The philosopher who's written a close to a history is a person called Walter Ott, but he doesn't really do it. So it would be an interesting thing for somebody to do. Okay. So the concept of laws started, I'm going to stop in a minute. The concept of laws had these two aspects at the very beginning, the unifying or organizing aspect and the constraining aspect. What Eddy has done is picked up on one of the aspects. I've picked up on the other aspect. The reason I've done that is I find the constraining aspect absolutely ununderstandable. What does it mean for the laws to constrain? How do they do it? Is there a super law that's appealed to make them constrain, or does it just happen automatically because they're laws? I mean, there's a third alternative here. Some people think that the things in nature themselves have powers and they produce the laws. Aristotle kind of had a view like that, but he didn't have that as a mathematical view about laws. But other people in contemporary times have taken up that view. It doesn't work very well in contemporary physics. Okay, but these are the main three views. There are a few other views around. So Eddy and I are here to battle. Unifying versus constraining. Eddy might want to say both. I say jettison the constraining, because once you have the unifying, you got everything you need.
Okay, so when you said super law, is there a super law that governs the regular laws? The analogy to Descartes would be the super law is God, and God is the one governing.
Absolutely, you got it, Curt.
Okay, so the way that I see the disagreement between you both is that we can think of traffic laws as an analogy, and most of us would say that traffic laws cause the motion, or orchestrate at least, the motion of the cars. But then there's also something like a weather report where we're just documenting patterns that we observe. So it sounds like, Eddy, you're more on the traffic laws are the laws, And then Barry or more on, we're just summarizing. These are just descriptions of what's occurring.
You're really good, Curt. That's a very good way to put it.
Okay. Thank you.
Or at least
Please.
it's very favorable to my point. But I mean, notice this. In the other room, I can come out because I've driven just once in Budapest, and I managed to get a ticket during that one time. So you can violate the laws of man. Nature cannot violate the laws of God.
Why not?
Well, that's a really good question, isn't it? Why not? Well, maybe because laws just unify nature. So there's nothing there to violate.
I think there is this question of what's explaining the no exception clause for summaries view. So suppose we don't think laws govern, laws constrain. Suppose we think that laws merely summarize and unify. What's about the laws of nature that they have no exceptions? They apply to almost everything, or everything literally, in the universe.
Yeah. They unify everything. Isn't that interesting? We live in, well, first of all, we don't really know that because general relativity and quantum mechanics have not been unified, as I was reminded last night with my string theorist friend, linked to that. And I didn't have to be reminded of it, of course. But the hope is, Einstein had this hope. Einstein, who many people think of as at some point in his life, he became a believer in God. I've read Einstein pretty closely. I don't think that's true. I'm not absolutely certain. But he did express faith. He expressed faith that a scientist has to have, that nature will be unified. And so science works under the assumption that he can find a unification, or she can find a unification of nature. And so far, it's worked. In fact, let me make another historical note, which I find astonishing. After Descartes proposed his project for the next millennia, finding the mathematical laws of nature, he wrote a few down. They were abysmal failure, actually, as laws of nature. They didn't, well, he kind of came close to inertia, but he wasn't very good at it. Along 80 years later, another guy came along, the Frenchman's archenemy, Isaac Newton. And he basically satisfied Descartes' dream up to a point. If Descartes had lived to see Newton, I don't want to go into what I'm about to say couldn't be broadcast. I mean, it's amazing to think about what he would think. Newton came up with a few simple laws and a scheme for laws, which looked like it was going to unify all of nature. And many people thought for a long time that it did. So until he got into more careful examination that they discovered it didn't. Okay, but it does. It works very well. If you want to get your pendulum clock working or your cannonballs flying in the right direction, Newton's laws are very good.
So I want to hear from Eddy about where he agrees and contrasts with your earlier views. So Eddy, please.
Yeah. So that's very helpful, Barry. I think that the two roles of laws are both important. And the unifying role is one we're motivated and inspired to find in the laws of nature. But without this constraint, the basic constraint, it's not clear how the unifying thing does any explanation, right? So I think it's taken for granted in many scientific communities that the laws, the principles we find in the end can explain, and they constrain or govern somehow. They explain how things fall in the same way, how things move in the same right way. And of course, people focus on the unifying part. And they say, okay, what is the simplest way and most natural way and most unifying way we can find laws of nature right down, principles and equation right down that explains things. Of course, people are not very explicit about how laws explain. And there will be debates about this. And there will be two ways to cash out how people think about laws of nature. But I do think that the majority of scientists, the naive view, the flat-footed view, is the view that laws, even though they're nice, they have to satisfy this constraint relation or this governing role. Otherwise, they're not laws. They're not something we
Mhm.
aspire to find in nature.
That's what you say. Now, Eddy, you're talking about taking advice from scientists. Do you take advice from the general scientists about what you want to think about quantum mechanics?
Quantum mechanics is a difficult case.
Shut up and calculate, Eddy. Shut up and calculate. You do not. Of course, what scientists have done is they bought into Descartes' general picture, and they started using this language of governing. That's the language they're using, governing and constraining, as though they somehow couldn't do without it. It's like you had a crutch that you don't need anymore. You never used. It never held you up.
So maybe we should clarify the view of constraining and summarizing, and just for the audience. Maybe you should say
Please.
first.
Well, you put summarizing in my mouth. I did not say
Okay,
summarizing.
okay.
How about I summarize and also explain summarizing? I'll do so with an analogy again for people who are educated in physics. So maybe a germane analogy, you can tell me if this is germane or not, is the action principle. So we extremize action. Now, one could argue that the universe is genuinely extremizing its action. It's lazy if we're doing the least action principle. Alternatively, someone can contend that that's just the stationary action principle is just an elegant way of summarizing what nature is doing. The principle itself isn't causative. It doesn't drive anything. It just encapsulates the behavior in a concise summary. So that's one way of viewing, or at least one way that I view the difference between a law of nature causing something. Now, what I'm confused about, Barry, is there some meta principle that says that the laws of physics are even describable by something simple? So you say that it's all unified, or it could be. There's something in algorithmic information theory called Kolmogorov complexity.
We both know it well.
And it could be, conceivably, that the universe is not compressible. It could be. It doesn't seem like that. I mean, it seems like we're able to write down something relatively short and do some predictions. So is there, in your mind, some meta principle that suggests that the universe is indeed compressible outside of initial conditions? And we can also talk about initial conditions.
We can. So a couple of things here. One is, I like the way you put things. I think it's good. When talking about the universe being compressible, you have to think about which parts you're going to compress. And the parts you're not going to compress, Kolmogorov complexity has a lot to do with too. Because along in the 19th century, along came a couple of people who figured out how to supplement the laws of nature in a way so they give much, much more information about the ordinary facts in the world. I'm sure you know what I'm referring to, yes?
Probability.
Probability. Okay, so what's not compressible you can get a lot of information about by introducing the notion of probability. I have very definite views about how to think about probability as well. Eddy and I were having a long conversation. I don't know, when was it, Eddy? My brain is going. When did we have this long conversation? We thought we might actually almost be in agreement about how thing about objective probability. That's what got me into philosophy, in fact. And it's one of the big questions about giving a good account of what objective probability is. It's really fascinating that physicists, mathematicians, biologists, they know how to use the notion of probability pretty well. They don't know what they're talking about. Bertrand Russell had a most wonderful thing. I'm sure you know this, that Bertrand Russell is great. If you want to go get a one-line quote to use for something, you go to Russell. He said, probability is the most important concept in modern science, especially since nobody knows what it means. I think that's verbatim.
Yeah, there are many of these quips where someone says that so-and-so, when no one knows what it means. Entropy, for instance, I think von Neumann said that.
Yeah.
So...
Yeah, but I know what entropy means. So screw von Neumann. Von Neumann was much smarter than me, but he knew what it meant too. Okay. I don't believe that.
Okay, so Eddy, one of the questions from Barry earlier was, well, what does it mean? What is this super law that governs the laws? Like, what's going on here when you say that? And also, what does it mean to explain? Because you keep using the word explain.
Right.
So colloquially, when someone is explaining to someone else, they say, okay, can you explain to me how do I get to the CN Tower. I'm in Toronto. So let's say, explain to me how I get to the CN Tower. They say, okay, you go forward from here, you make a left, etc. But they don't say something like you take infinity categories and you do so. Like, that's not an explanation to them because they don't know what infinity categories are. So explaining has something to do with meeting the person where they are and then providing a line of justification. But that's colloquially. And you're obviously speaking about the laws of physics. I don't imagine our demotic understanding of explaining is what you mean. So what do you mean? Just a moment. Don't go anywhere. Hey, I see you inching away. Don't be like The Economy. Instead, read The Economist. I thought all The Economist was something that CEOs read to stay up to date on world trends. And that's true, but that's not only true. What I found more than useful for myself personally is their coverage of math, physics, philosophy, and AI, especially how something is perceived by other countries and how it may impact markets. For instance, The Economist had an interview with some of the people behind DeepSeek the week DeepSeek was launched. No one else had that. Another example is The Economist has this fantastic article on the recent dark energy data, which surpasses even Scientific American's coverage, in my opinion. They also have the chart of everything. It's like the chart version of this channel. It's something which is a pleasure to scroll through and learn from. Links to all of these will be in the description, of course. Additionally, just this week, there were 2 articles published. One about the Dead Sea Scrolls and how AI models can help analyze the dates that they were published by looking at their transcription qualities. And another article that I loved is the 40 best books published this year so far. Sign up at economist.com/TOE for the yearly subscription. I do so, and you won't regret it. Remember to use that TOE code as it counts to helping this channel and gets you a discount. Now, The Economist's commitment to rigorous journalism means that you get a clear picture of the world's most significant developments. I am personally interested in the more scientific ones, like this one on extending life via mitochondrial transplants, which creates actually a new field of medicine, something that would make Michael Levin proud. The Economist also covers culture, finance and economics, business, international affairs, Britain, Europe, the Middle East, Africa, China, Asia, the Americas, and of course, the USA. Whether it's the latest in scientific innovation or the shifting landscape of global politics, The Economist provides comprehensive coverage, and it goes far beyond just headlines. Look, if you're passionate about expanding your knowledge and gaining a new understanding, a deeper one, of the forces that shape our world, then I highly recommend subscribing to The Economist. I subscribe to them, and it's an investment into your intellectual growth. It's one that you won't regret. As a listener of this podcast, you'll get a special 20% off discount. Now you can enjoy The Economist and all it has to offer for less. Head over to their website, www.economist.com/TOE, TOE, to get started. Thanks for tuning in, and now let's get back to the exploration of the mysteries of our universe. Again, that's economist.com/TOE. Demotic understanding of explaining is what you mean. So what do you mean?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a huge continuum of notions of explanation, meeting us where we are in ordinary life versus in the scientific context, explaining phenomena in double-slit experiment using the laws of physics. And I don't think it's a big difference. There might be differences in terms of things we invoke to explain, whether I'm invoking the absence or the presence of some, a person to explain something falling or breaking. But the kind of explanation, I think, is continuous. And even ordinary life explanations, they are backed by something. Insofar as they're accurate or they are faithful, they should be tracking some kind of general laws, maybe about human nature, maybe about human psychology, economics, and then all the way back to deeper and deeper principles. So for me, explanation is by some simple constraint. And this is the view of laws of nature developed with Sheldon Goldstein, a metaphysicist at Rutgers University. So we call this view minimal primitivism.
Right.
So for us, the laws are basic. They underline everything. So they're not reducible to something else. They're not summarizing. They're not unifying, merely unifying. They can be nice summaries. They can be nice unifying simple features. But they are fundamental features of the universe. They coexist with universe, the mosaic. And they can give rise to certain kind of causal explanations, how A causes B and B causes C. But causation is not fundamental to the picture. And the the example you used earlier was very helpful. The least action principle. It was one of the examples that motivate us to think about this more general picture of governing laws. Some people think that, well, if you have real laws in nature governing things, there must be causal laws. So A at T1 causes B at T2, and that's the way the universe moves, step by step, moment by moment, generating. But think about general relativity, think about modern physics, think about quantum mechanics, and least action principle, Lagrange mechanics. All of this seem pull away from this step-by-step production picture. So I remember you have Emily Atlan on the YouTube channel before,
Yes.
and she was also suggesting this all-at-once picture. So we have very similar ideas of time and laws. So for us too, the laws govern the whole universe, the entire space-time and its contents. And in a sense, all at once. For me, explanation has to be not just any constraint, but it has to be some simple constraints. So simple laws of nature. This action principle, quantum mechanical Schrodinger equation, Einstein field equations, they are not simple in the sense that they're not like something we learn from elementary school, but they're simple in the sense we can build up on simpler principles and develop sophistication and work with more and more complicated mathematical formalism. But they are much better than what could have been the case, which is no law, no simple principle, and no regularity at all. And then we'd be completely lost. Science cannot be done in that case.
We wouldn't be lost.
They wouldn't
Eddie,
be.
we wouldn't be. We wouldn't.
In the limiting case that there are still constraints.
We
wouldn't.
We wouldn't be.
We wouldn't be here. Right. Mm-hmm.
There's some fancy words that probably will come up that haven't. I'm surprised they haven't so far, like non-Humean, which is not to be confused with non-human, although Barry, you're so staunchly Humean that
That's not true.
you may say that to be non-Humean is to be
No,
non-human.
I'm going to correct that in a little while to tell you what my actual view is. But Eddy knows why we're laughing, and I don't think I can repeat the story because it's at the expense of a colleague. Okay, but confusing Humean with human can make a big problem.
Okay. And the word mosaic also came up. So I think this is a great time for you, Barry, to define what mosaic is so that the audience can also follow. But also at the same time, while doing that, please explore the relationship between boundary conditions and laws.
Okay, so a lot to do here. First of all, given what Eddy just said, as I said before, I can agree with a lot of what he said and a lot of the words that he said. I don't want to make it sound as though I don't. Of course, I think that in some sense the laws constrain. Of course, I think they explain. Of course, we have a different take on many of these notions, which we may want to get into if we want to get into the fine points here. Okay, now, in contemporary writing, while some philosophers have thought about what laws of nature are, David Hume had a little bit of a thought, though not much. Kant thought about it in some sense, and others did. It wasn't until the middle of the 20th century that a few philosophers cooked up some things. And then all of a sudden there was an upsurgence of people with views like Eddy's, because Eddy doesn't want to be tarred with these people, I think, but they're definitely in the same group. David Armstrong, Michael Tooley, and Fred Dretske. And they thought that laws were relations between properties, primitive facts, which were relations between properties, but primitive relations, which constrain or govern events. And another philosopher, or two other philosophers, looked at that and said, so they scratched their heads, so I can do that. How do they do that? How do they do this governing? How do they do this constraining? I know how the laws of man govern the laws of man. We have the courts and the prison system and so on that helps do it. And then, of course, what people want and desire and believe. They thought, maybe we don't need this constraining business. And David Lewis came up with a very interesting idea. Now I'm going to expound David Lewis's view. It's not my view, since other people will see this. I've published a book recently about this and about to publish a second book about it. So, I guess people care about their books. I'm not sure I did, but I do a little bit now.
I'll place a link to both of your books on screen and in the description right now.
Okay, one of us is a much better publicist than the other one, I have to say. But at any rate, so okay, I haven't done anything about it. So okay, well, my book has the cooler title, I think. We can maybe come to that later. Okay.
All right.
Okay. Now about your actual question. What should I say here? Okay, so here's David Lewis's view. David Lewis thought that all the primitive facts were primitive properties instantiated throughout all of space-time. So he thought there was an arena, the space-time arena. He wasn't very explicit because he left it open. How many dimensions does it have? He thought probably time just one dimension. Maybe space has many dimensions. He didn't really say. He thought that the fundamental properties were probably instantiated by point-like individuals, like particles maybe, or maybe just by points, because the properties themselves were sufficient to make for there being materiality. And the properties might be things like mass, charge, spin. Those are examples he gave. A silly example to give spin there, but he did. And there would be these properties. And so you imagine a mosaic filling in the tiles. So when God created the universe, on the Humean view, David Lewis's Humean view, all God had to do, God doesn't exist in time. So God doesn't have to do anything in time, just created the universe all at once. He created the whole of expanse of space and time and filled it up with fundamental properties. Lewis called them perfectly natural properties, instantiated at points or at point-like individuals throughout all these space and time. And since it was a space and time, these point-like individuals or points had spatial and temporal relations to each other. Then Lewis said, you know what Descartes was really after? He wanted the best systematization of this thing I put down here. Now, you guys may think it's a complete mess. It looks like that at first, but if you're clever enough, I've made you a key. If you learn mathematics, you will be able to learn it. And then our job, according to Lewis, is to find the best systematization of this. He used the word systematization. He did not use the word summary. Other people have used it for him. I like the word unifying better, the best unifying account of it. Now, I quickly want to add that this is not my view. My view is a little bit more complex, and maybe we want to get to that later. But this is in the neighborhood of my view. I like the part that it does not have that laws govern or constrain in a literal sense, and does not have laws as being primitive facts. So here's two places that Eddy and I absolutely disagree, which is great, because philosophy would not exist if it wasn't for disagreements. This is what makes it go round. Okay, that's Lewis's view. Now, the question for Lewis is, well, how do you give an account of explanation in this?
Right.
Okay, and I can come to that in a second. Then other questions like, where does probability fit into that? Lewis had a view, and I have a view about that.
There's also kind of I guess a basic question, Barry, for Lewis' view and the view of humanism, that at the bottom level, there's nothing that enforcing the pattern. There's nothing that making things happen. There's nothing that, setting a boundary in what's possible, what's not possible. So,
no, that's not true. That's totally not true.
Well, there's a mosaic. The mosaic is all there is in reality, right?
That's all there is. You're hankering after something more. But in fact, there is something that, as you say, enforces. The laws of nature enforce in a certain sense. So I can say just with you that because of the laws of gravity and the laws of the second law of motion and the size of the Earth and the size of the moon, that the moon will follow in an elliptical orbit, and that one side of the moon will be bulging out from the moon as the moon goes around the Earth, as though it was a tide on the moon.
But all of that is going to be up to us. All of that because explain and notions of explanation will be because how we think about the universe, how we come to interact with it is not because there is something, basic that does the explanation.
Well, this is what you're hankering after. You still would want God, and I understand. I mean, you may really want God.
I want
That's a
laws.
different issue. Okay. But you don't need law. Okay. This is what maybe the coup de grace. What would happen, Eddy, if God came and he whispered in your ears and said, "You know, Eddy, there are no primitive law facts. All I did was to make a mosaic, and I put a lot of patterns in it. A lot of patterns you can find." Would you give up explaining then?
Well, what about if God tells you that actually there are primitive laws and they do explanation?
Well, I know what I would say to God, what I did when I was 13 years old.
Which is?
Well, it's not something for public.
Okay, I see.
Okay.
Okay, but maybe Curt doesn't know what I'm referring to here even, but
But I mean, in that case, I would just say I would be wrong about the metaphysics. And yeah, there is no explanation in that case.
yeah, okay. Well, I think you'd just be wrong. Scientists
Right.
would not stop doing their science.
They should not
Absolutely
stop doing
not.
because yeah, go ahead, Curt.
Okay, well, let's talk about summaries versus best systems. So right now, Barry, you're being recorded. I don't know if that's a surprise to you. The audience is seeing you, okay? Not live, but they're going to see you at some point. So in some sense, this is a summary of you, of what you've been doing. Okay, I wouldn't say that explains what you've been doing. And I don't know what the difference is then in terms of this video versus a best system. So like the video is a summary. We can agree on that. Is it a best system? Why is it not a best system? How the heck can best systems explain?
This is not the best of best systems. Here's the heck how best systems can explain. They unify. They unified all, I'm now speaking for Lewis, they unify all of the mosaic. That's how they explain, because they're unifiers. Let me give you an example. It's something I think may be eye-opening to you. People for a long time looked at various phenomena. They looked at ice cubes melting. They looked at smoke dispersing in the air. They dropped some ink in water and it dispersed. They looked at people and they got old. All of these things, they have nothing to do with each other, right? But all of them involve there being particles of matter moving around in more or less in the accordance with Newtonian laws, not exactly Newton's laws, but more or less Newton's
Sure.
laws, and a certain probability distribution over all of these. That unifies all of this. That's what explains it. Once we see that these are all connected with each other, we have one of those aha experiences. Aha, now I see how it is that growing old and smoke dispersing in the air are really the same ilk.
Could it be that the laws of nature are not unified?
Well, in my view, I mean, unification is a matter of degree. It could turn out, maybe this will be the case, that no one will discover, and maybe because there isn't, a real unification of general relativity and quantum mechanics. I very much doubt that. I think one of those has got to go, and I think I know which one is going to change. But people will still be looking. But yeah, when you have faith, you have to know that it's faith. Science is based on faith. That's a really important point.
What do you mean?
I mean, scientists have to assume that there's order in nature. Now, in order to make themselves feel better about it, they like to posit there being these primitive facts that enforce the order. But in fact, they'll need another primitive fact to connect their primitive facts to the ordinary facts, and they'll need yet another primitive fact to make for their primitive facts. So they have primitives coming up there out of their whatever.
Okay, so there's something called the Munchausen trilemma. I think it's also known as the Agrippa trilemma, something like that, which is that to give any explanation, you have three options. You have foundationalism, so you start with some axiom which it can't be justified, because if you're making an appeal to something else, that something else would be the axiom. So some unjustified axiom, or you have an infinite regress, or you have circularity. Okay, so you just pointed out that there's an infinite regress, but that is also a potential option. Maybe the universe is an infinite regress. Now, Eddy, I'm not trying to say that you believe that. And maybe you don't believe that, but if you don't, please comment on anything that Barry's just said.
Yeah, so I like the setup you just mentioned, Curt. So in terms of foundationalist versus infinite regress, I think for laws of nature, laws of physics, the view I have and developed with Charlotte Goldstein is a kind of foundational picture. It's kind of a flat-footed foundational picture, trying to capture what physicists have in mind, what the non-human philosophers have in mind, which is there is something in the world, the laws of nature, they govern what happens in everything, every room, every particle, every field. And these laws are kind of the fundamental axioms in the theory, and they are not summary of what happens. So unlike the Humean picture, the axioms here are real axioms. The axioms in the fundamental metaphysical sense, realist sense, they are the foundational axioms.
Really real axioms. Are piano's axioms real axioms?
I agree, but then the best system axioms, they are, they supervene on the mosaic. The laws are at the basic level of reality. So there's a universe and there are laws, and the laws govern the universe. On the Humean view, there's a universe and that's it. And the mosaic is all there's fundamental. The laws supervene on the universe, and other things supervene on the laws, and so on. But the laws are not at this basic level of reality.
Well, as I've said a few times, I expounded David Lewis's view, not my own view. I don't know whether we want to come to that at all.
Yes.
My own view is a little, okay, I can explain it. It's a little bit, in some ways, a little bit, certain respects, closer to Eddy's. Because what I do think is fundamental is reality, nature. It's fundamental. But I also have I have a funny view about reality. But can I come back to the trilemma? Because I had something in
Yes.
mind about that.
Yeah.
Another quote, this time not from Russell, but from Otto Neurath, who, and he's been quoted especially by Quine. I'm sure you know this quote from Neurath that Quine uses. He said, "Science is like a ship at sea that we have to rebuild while at sail. But there's no dry dock, no foundational place to bring it into. To put it up on whatever you put it up on, and to redo it. We got to redo it at sea." And Neurath really had it right, I think. He was responding to the foundationalists of Vienna School. I'm not very far from Vienna. I'll be there not so long. Budapest, Vienna, near each other. So it's a kind of circularity, but it's circularity with a purpose. It's a circularity aiming to coming up with a better and better and better ship. So there is a guiding light. What science should be like. It should be as simple as can be, as comprehensive as can be, as informative to human beings as can be. So it needs a lot of different parts. And scientists have been fairly good, not at understanding what they're doing. I don't think they're good at that, but they're very good at doing what they're doing. Understanding what they're doing, that's the job for Eddy and me to do.
It sounds like you're talking about science, what science is like and what scientists are like, but what is nature like?
Well, that's what we're trying to find out.
Yes. Now, I know Eddy earlier, and I don't want to butcher what you said, but earlier you were saying, look, these are then tied to our descriptions. Like you said something like that. There's something then subjective to Barry's view, if I was understanding you correctly. So feel free to comment. Maybe I misunderstood.
Yeah, the thought was that the Humean view, on the Lewis kind of best system view, best summary view, what laws are, which propositions, which sentences are laws, which sentences are counterfactuals, which sentences express what we can do, what we cannot do, are basically tracking what we mean by simple and informative summaries, which can be very much up to us. So suppose I somehow convince the scientific community to change our standards of, say, simplicity, then it could be the case that the laws could change too. You change a different set of laws.
Right.
And that doesn't seem like what we mean by laws of nature. Laws of nature, laws of physics seems like something completely objective and independent of us, our interests, our situations, our political allegiance, and so on. So it shouldn't be so dependent on what we think and what we do. I agree with Barry that there's an important part of how we do science, what is a rational procedure to carry out, the method to carry out science that might be tracking our interests. And that's kind of a big mystery on both sides, on humanism and non-humanism. But minimal primitivism on non-human view, I like, the laws are what they are in themselves. The laws don't change in response to our interests. The laws don't shift just by changing our standards of criteria of evaluation. And that, I think, is a basic necessary condition for laws. It's a precondition for something to be a law.
Do you think I disagree with that? Yeah, right?
I think you disagree with that, right, Darren?
Wrong.
Oh,
Wrong.
okay.
Suppose, let me ask you, Eddy, suppose someone said, I have a new idea for baseball. What we do is we play baseball in a teacup. And what we do in playing baseball is instead of having innings, we just have tea bags. And the way we play baseball is it depends on how many times we dip the tea bag into the tea. What do you think about that?
That's not a very good rule for baseball.
It ain't baseball. Well, if somebody changed the rules in the way you're talking about, it would not be good rules for laws. Now, why is that? Well, tradition and history and the fact that it's been successful in the past. You don't need a crutch to stand on. You just keep looking for a crutch. Okay. I mean, I'm attributing this to you. I was going to complain a little while ago that you were attributing mysteries to humans, which they don't have, and you shouldn't do that. And I shouldn't do that to you. But if you understand that from my point of view, your constraining is kind of like still hankering after God. You don't need it.
What about the laws of mathematics and laws of logic? They're not mere summaries.
What about them?
They seem to
You're
constrain.
going to tell me what do they constrain?
Logical realities and mathematical realities. That 1 + 1 is 2 is not 3.
Do you know that? Of course, I agree that 1 + 1 is 2 and not 3. I'm glad we are in agreement about that. But how do they do the constraining? I'm not saying, I'm not putting a view about them. I find this the deepest of mysteries that I know about.
I agree that it is a fundamental primitive, and the way we understand the primitive notion, like, in mathematics, we have primitive notions.
I did not say that.
Yes, okay, let me say, how one might remove some mysteries. One can remove some mysteries by drawing connections or define things in terms of those primitive notions. We can define counterfactuals, causal relations, notions of time and dependence in terms of the laws. And then we see, okay, how laws do things in the world is by making certain things true, making certain things happen. And then we just kind of talk about things we are familiar with, like how tables and chairs depend on each other on configurations.
From my point of view, you just keep repeating your point over and over again. Doesn't make it any more true, just like my point doesn't get any more true when I repeat it over
No,
and over again.
I'm trying to clarify this point that on Loewer's view on traditional humanism, before moving to Barry's new view of package deal account, on traditional humanism, there is this worry about idealism. The law seems idealistic. They seem dependent on our interests and our wills, and too much so that one might worry whether they deserve the name laws.
Lewis himself had that worry. He called it ratbag idealism.
That's right.
So I started thinking, I knew it came from down under because Lewis liked to go visit Australia a lot. So I knew it must be from Aussie, Australian, or New Zealand. And in fact, it is. And I thought at first that a rat bag was a bag that rats carry their cheese around in.
Yeah, it sounds like something negative, but it doesn't. It sounds like something attributable to a person. Like you are a rat bag or you have rat bag qualities.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You got to the chase, whereas I want to have a little fun with it first. So then I thought maybe it's a bag that the rat catchers carry their rats around in, but it's neither. I spoke to Al Hayek, who's my Australian source on stuff, and he said it just means disreputable. So you went right to the chase, Curt. Just means disreputable. So Lewis was afraid that people might think his view is idealist, and he thought that would be bad. Then he argued that it wasn't. And I devoted many pages of my book arguing that my view, and Lewis's view too, is not idealist in any bad sense. Now, to say that there is not, as one philosopher called it, the mark of the serpent all over our concepts, like the concept of laws. That philosopher was Hilary Putnam, who's one of my heroes. So Hillary Putnam had a view that he called realism with a human face. I call my view realism with a scientific face, because science attributes a certain goal or aim to what we want by way of unification, by way of simplification, by way of informativeness, by way of symmetries, and a bunch of other things like that. And if we try to satisfy that, maybe nature will oblige.
So on this view, Barry, it is the ideal scientific practice and the in that limit of inquiry that when science is completed, that kind of standard, that is the rational standard for choice of how we evaluate laws of nature on the best system account or on the package deal account.
Mm-hmm.
And
That's right.
That saying is not as subjective as I thought before, because now there is a standard, and unique standard. It doesn't change. It is whatever it is.
Just like baseball has its standards.
But Barry, there is kind of a worry about circularity here, right? What we mean by ideal, a good scientific practice, and what we evaluate that to be the fixed point, it depends on what we think about counterfactuals and probabilities and people's abilities and people's actions, interactions in the community, the social aspects. And all of them are modal concepts that imbue with the laws of nature. So usually we understand those notions in terms of laws. So if we cash out laws in terms of that, and that in terms of laws, there seems to be a big, maybe kind of distant circle, but still it's a circle.
You could call it a circle if you want, but it's a virtuous circle if it's a circle. There is a kind of all of it hanging together kind of a feel to it, but it does all seem to hang together. Okay, and that's what's important about it. If it didn't, we'd be in trouble. But so far, so good. And philosophers have been working to spell out theories of what probability is, what counterfactuals are, so that it does hang together. And scientists the standards have changed over the history of science. Aristotle had different standards than Newton had, and Einstein had different standards than Newton had, and quantum mechanics contemporary has different standards. And the mathematics used to express the laws of nature have changed over time. And what counts as a simple account has changed over time. So these things do change over time, but of course they change in orderly ways, still with the aim of coming up with a kind of account of the nature of reality. Now, it would be nice to think that out there in heaven, God wrote down, these are what the laws are, man. You better get them. And maybe even move things around in accordance with it, as Descartes thought. But I don't think it's like that, because I don't think we understand how that could work.
Okay, so I want us to be more analytic and less colorful. So when we use words like this is a rat bag or this is God, and I assume God is a synonym for magic, like you're evoking magic. I'm evoking a human face, a scientific face, a virtuous circle. That's like poisoning the well, because it's saying that firstly, well, it's giving the impression to the audience like these are the ideas that are foolish and these are the ideas that are more. So let's be more analytic. Explain what reality is and what nature is. Barry, please, I want to hear what you think it is, because
I can't explain what reality is. That's what science is doing its best job at coming into account of reality. In my view, reality is describable more or less by quantum mechanics. Now, to get into an account of what quantum mechanics is about is a different subject matter. But that's the what we think of as the fundamental laws, because that's turned out to be a mathematical way of expressing a big chunk of the best systematization of our world. It systematizes the periodic table, for example.
Sorry, are you all in agreement in terms of philosophy? For instance, realism versus idealism or anti-realism or so on. Do you all agree on some broad outlook? Or do you disagree? Like, is one of you an idealist and the other's a materialist?
I think Barry and I, if I'm correct, we are roughly in agreement on the general methodology and the realist picture of metaphysics. Maybe some differences in the details about how realist we are.
I'm a realist with, as Hillary says, a human face or a scientific face, but I'm definitely on the realist side of this discussion. I do think that there are people And if there were no people or creatures, intelligent creatures, there wouldn't be science. So you need intelligent creatures for there to be science. But I don't think that makes me an idealist.
Yeah. So on my view, what's real? So I'm a realist too. And on my view, what is fundamental and what is real in the universe are two things. The first thing is the mosaic kind of thing, the universe, the space-time manifold. It could be space-time in general relativity, or maybe quantum gravity kind of manifold, or maybe more general kind of string theoretic description of the universe. But that by itself is not complete. If I write down the theory of everything in terms of the space-time manifold, then it is missing the most important ingredient, which is the laws of nature. So it's going to be the second part, which is the laws of physics, laws of nature, the fundamental laws that govern the universe. And when we capitalize both parts, then the theory is complete at a fundamental level. And this should entail all the important regularities, order we see around us about gas in a box, about cells, about galaxies, about tables. And this might include, the law might include deterministic laws of temporal evolution, boundary condition laws like past hypothesis, plus probabilistic laws such as stochastic processes or genuine randomness, or maybe some probabilistic boundary conditions. And together, this will give us, I hope, a very unifying and simple and powerful theory that can explain a lot of regularities. So on the methodology part, that we should still strive for describing this in terms of simple, informative, unifying descriptions. And that's going to be in agreement with a lot of humanism and what Barry said. And in terms of probability, there would be a crucial difference, I think. There's going to be some kind of questions on how do we understand probabilistic laws in terms of constraints.
I think we should put that off for a little bit if you want to get to it, because I want to deal with two things. One is, of course, I can agree with a lot of what Eddy just said in words, but I did want to say that if you were to write down every last event in the mosaic, what would happen is his arm would fall off way before you got to the end. And in fact, his arm and what's going on in it would be in the mosaic someplace where it puts their circularity.
Right, it's a self-reference.
That's self-reference. Okay. So I'm not suggesting anything like that, of course. What I think is that what science is aiming at, or what Lewis is suggesting, I'll expound my view if you want in a minute.
Please.
I think what Lewis is aiming at is a best systematization of the mosaic. And he hopes that there is one. It is a matter of faith. And Newton, in fact, did come up with something that looked like something pretty close to it. Wasn't quite right. When Maxwell came along and improved how to put light and electromagnetism into it, it improved things a lot, but created a big problem. That big problem was solved by one of the big problems was solved by special relativity, but some other big problems remained. One of them was how to talk about the structure of matter. That problem was solved to a large extent by quantum mechanics. So the system got more and more complicated as it encompassed more and more of reality. Okay, and all along, something stayed the same. What Arthur Eddington called the supreme law of nature. And he didn't mean it that constrained, incidentally, but he called it the supreme law of nature. It's the second law of nature.
Wow.
And what he meant by it was not just that entropy doesn't decrease. What he meant by it is the probabilistic assumption that Boltzmann used in order to entail the probabilistic version of the second law. He said, no matter how the dynamical people's proposals for what the dynamical laws are change as they get better and better, no matter what this will stay. And this is very interesting. And the reason is that it provides the connection between macroscopic phenomena and microscopic phenomena. Okay, that it's always a probabilistic connection. So given the microscopic state, let's say the fundamental quantum mechanical or Newtonian state. Of course, you're given it. You could say exactly what will happen. Laplace famously told that to Napoleon. But nobody is ever given the fundamental state of the world at a time. What you can do is only come up with a probabilistic account of it. You could say it's just as likely to be this kind of state as that kind of state, or give some sort of probability distribution of the states. Turns out Boltzmann assumed the simplest of all possible probability assumption, and he looks like he was right. And then when Eddington said that that's the supreme law of nature, he knew what he was talking about, because that has survived. It's right. It's right.
I don't see any contradiction between what you're saying and what Eddy believes, because the laws themselves, in my understanding, could be probabilistic. Maybe you believe they aren't.
Oh, yeah.
Eddy.
There's no contradiction there. The contradiction is how we understand the word constrain. I don't think it's doing any work. I think constrain just means satisfies. That's all. What Eddy thinks constrain is some sort of like semi-causal notion. It makes things happen.
Okay. So then would you say that the dispute hinges on theories of causation here?
Well, I think Eddy would reject
Right.
by saying that the laws cause anything.
Right.
But he should. But they're doing something like that. They're making things happen. He used that language before.
Right. I don't mean making things happen in time in a causal way. I do mean that. So the notion of constraint here is a primitive, right? And insofar as it's a primitive notion, I cannot define a primitive in terms of other things in my theory. Otherwise, it's not going to be a primitive. Just like you said, the foundational kind of hierarchy. If I really have a foundational hierarchy, being honest, I got to tell you my axioms and primitive vocabulary and trying to elucidate the connections by drawing connections to things we understand. But if we say, okay, if we don't understand the primitive notions from the other point of view, I can try to convince them. Maybe it is something familiar. Maybe it is something that can elucidate things we understand anyways. So the causal explanations can be understood in terms of boundary condition laws plus deterministic evolution with stochastic evolution. And those things are familiar. It seems like familiar things about A causing B can be understood in terms of the primitive constraint. Even the constraint is not temporal, even it's not like something that producing things in time.
Yeah. Okay. So let's focus on that in just a minute. But from my point of view, what you're doing is running together issues about ontology with issues about what might be called ideology or conceptuology. Axioms have to do with how you formulate your concepts. So, for example, real number theory can be axiomatized in a lot of different ways. God didn't say what the right primitives are. Geometry, Euclidean geometry, can be axiomatized in a bunch of different ways. God didn't say these are the right axioms. Same with number theory. There are many ways of axiomatizing it. It's the same way with the laws of nature, for that matter. Is it Lagrange's principles, Hamilton's principles, or what? Okay, so I think these are matters of ideology or conceptuology, how you formulate the best systematization. I think that is, to a certain extent, a free, not free, but I mean, it's something that can be done in different ways. Matters of ontology have to do with what exists and what the relationships are among the things that exist. I think David Lewis thinks, again, I haven't really come to my view. David Lewis thinks that what exists is the mosaic, and laws are propositions, all right, but they're propositions that are made true or false by the structure of the mosaic. They don't need a special truth maker other than the mosaic and the rules for what it is to be a law.
So I don't think I'm running over the distinctions, Barry. My view of ontology is more expansive than usual. I allow properties and relations to be part of ontology too, and laws to be part of ontology.
I don't mind it. Wait. I don't like that, but I don't mind properties and relations being part of ontology. I don't think laws are. I think somebody could say, I think there are these things. I'm going to name them. I call them laws or nomoses. Okay, and I say, well, what do they do, and how do they do it? And I think you're going to be dumbfounded.
So Barry, are you in the minority? Are you suggesting I'm a physicist and there are no laws of physics, technically speaking.
What you mean is that nobody has discovered the laws of physics. You don't mean that there are no laws of physics, do you?
No. I'm asking, what do you mean? Do you mean to say that when
I've told
people
you.
speak about laws of physics, there aren't actually laws, they're just best systems, or hopefully we will get to the best system?
I don't know what this just business is. This is a big deal. Okay. It's not a just, it's a big deal. But I'll come to my view now. I don't have Lewis's view. I want to have even less than he has, in some sense, more than another sense. I think what there is fundamentally is reality. I think the view I have, the philosopher who's most like the view I have, I believe, although you're going to find this very weird, is Spinoza. He's a fellow traveler in some sense. Okay. Spinoza thought that what there was reality. Now, he called it the mind of God. I can do without that, but there's reality. Reality can be described in a lot of different ways. Reality can make true or false the descriptions that we come up with. Now, you might ask, what are descriptions and how do we come up with? Those are excellent questions. That's for another session, I think, and I've written about that as well. But that's not what we're talking about here. But so reality can be described in various ways. Among the ways they can be described is ways that satisfy certain goals that people have come up with in their life. The goals of understanding their world, and which they've articulated more and more along wanting to have a simple, comprehensive systematization that can account for things like the motions of the planets and the motions of the shooting stars and the motions of projectiles and pendula and many things that begin with the word P, planets, peculiar people, all sorts of things that begin with the letter P, have accounts of their motions. So motion became a very important notion in physics. We wanted to account for their motions by systematizing the motions of things. That's what I was talking about when I was saying about ice melting and smoke dispersing and ink diffusing. Okay. All of this is motion. And it's systematized by the molecular theory of matter and the fundamental dynamical laws. Maybe they're Newtonian, or maybe they're more sophisticated and electromagnetic, or maybe you're going to need a probability assumption that Boltzmann added too. That systematizes all of that and shows their connections. For me, that's what explaining is.
So what is fundamental on this view, Barry? Is it the macroscopic things in motion that's fundamental, or something just called reality with no description, no joints, no carving, no structure, in the sense that I cannot even describe. It's like Kantian noumena, the thing in itself. If I have any description, it's going to be bringing it closer to us.
No. First of all, just reality. Just reality. Let's listen to those words, Eddy. Just reality. That sounds like a lot to me. Now, when you say it doesn't have any description, quite the opposite. It has many descriptions. The science, satisfying the goals of science, is one way of describing reality. Maybe there are other ways of describing aspects of reality. Maybe artistic ways are ways of describing aspects of reality that satisfy different criteria, which don't match those of science. Maybe there are other ways. Sometimes people have wondered whether the way we describe human beings in terms of beliefs and desires can be fit in with the way we describe the motion of objects in mechanics. I think it can be, but you got to think about it. Some people think it can't be, like Donald Davidson and some other philosophers, maybe Quine.
Putnam as well. So Putnam, one of your heroes, said that the sooner that we understand that the realm of knowledge that encompasses reality isn't just the sphere of science, that there are other spheres like ethics, and Aristotle thought that as well, the sooner we'll come to a saner view of ourselves and of science.
I'm all for that. But it doesn't mean that it all can't be fit together. And as far as the motions of things are concerned, their physics is the king. So if a motive or a desire moves you, It's ultimately, you got to be accounted for in terms of neurons firing in your brain or something like that. Now, I don't know how to do it. Nobody knows how to do it. But the hope is that people will figure out. People have made progress towards understanding how it is that the brain makes people move when they have beliefs and desires, and fitting beliefs and desires into this picture. One of the great heroes at Rutgers, was he gone by the time you came, Eddy? Jerry?
Jerry was still teaching. Yes.
Still teaching. So Jerry Fodor. Unfortunately, Curt, you can't interview him. He would make the greatest of interviews.
Mm.
And if you could interview him, it would make the greatest of the greatest interviews.
Mm.
But he tried to make contributions to this very subject that we're talking about, and it's interesting.
So the reality has many guides, many descriptions. All of them are equally valid, but there's no fundamental.
What's this word valid? Where how does the word valid creep in here?
Okay, so there are all gonna be good descriptions. They're all descriptions. All right.
There are many descriptions,
and there's no fundamental, unique descriptions of in terms of perfectly natural properties. What's fundamental in the world? That's not going to be privileged by this package deal account.
Well, it's going to be privileged by the package deal account. I mean, there may be more than one of them, actually. There may not be one that's privileged. I do think we have a good reason to believe that already. But that's a little dispute within the thing. But the thing that you're focusing on is the package deal account. It pays attention to the criteria that science has evolved over the history of science, and trying to mesh those and fit those together. And those are ever evolving. They're evolving as of now, how to fit new methods of mathematics. I mean, can you use algebraic topology in physics? People argue about that.
And the laws will change as the standards evolve.
Laws don't change. What happens is that we have to change our criteria. I don't know what you want to say. Baseball changes. We have a new game, or what? But I do think we could say that we were mistaken before. We've come up with a better account of what the
we're
laws...
mistaken about what laws are or what laws there are.
Okay, someone asks what the laws are. They want a list of things. They want Schrodinger's equation, maybe, or F equals ma, or the law of gravity, or Einstein's field equations, or something like that. These are what the laws are. They're equations, things written down. What the laws are is the kind of thing we've been engaged in, a philosophical account about what it is to be a law. Okay, now I haven't really given my package deal account. I don't know whether the time has come to do it. Has it come?
Sure.
Okay, so I don't like Lewis's account because it too, I think, rests on a crutch. His crutch is perfectly natural properties. I threw away my crutches.
Okay.
There's like two crutches you're throwing away, right? First of all, the fundamental law that constrain or govern, and second is fundamental mosaic.
Right, the mosaic, right? I don't have those crutches.
Just like I believe in both of them. I believe mosaic and laws are fundamental. You believe neither is fundamental.
Right. Okay. You keep using the word fundamental. It can be used in a lot of different senses. But at any rate, so what I think is where we start is where science started. They started by noticing things like when you throw rocks, they move in a certain kind of path, kind of similar path to the way a projectile moves when you shoot a cannon. Maybe a similar path in certain ways to the way a shooting star moves when you see it go in a parabola. Maybe in a similar way to we might think how a planet moves if the parabola doesn't close and becomes an ellipse.
Okay.
So you note these similarities about these things, and we want to unify them. What we discover is that in order to unify the macroscopic, we have to introduce the microscopic, things we can't see. We introduce them, like in my case, what I was giving with the ice and the ink and the smoke, that if we think of these things as being made up out of little particles, we see the connections between all of these behaviors in accordance with certain, we might call principles. Eddy might call them fundamental laws. I just call them attempts at a best systematization of reality. And we try to come up with that. And in fact, we've done, not me, I haven't done diddly here. I did a little bit. I published 2 scientific papers in my life, so I'm not a very good contributor to this. But it's not something that human beings have done. They've come up with a pretty good systematization, which involve introducing unobservable microscopic things in order to help systematize the macroscopic. So in some sense, the macroscopic plays a kind of fundamental and epistemologically fundamental way, but it's not ontologically fundamental. What's ontologically fundamental for me is reality, which can be described in many, many different ways. Now, Eddy would like there to be a unique way to describe reality. That's the way. Okay, but that's not me.
What distinguishes reality from another world that isn't reality?
So possible worlds have come up earlier in the discussion. So that's a very interesting notion. It goes back in some sense to Leibniz used this notion, and some people thought then that he should be burnt as a heretic for using the idea of possible worlds. David Lewis, one of the heroes of the story, he made a big deal out of possible worlds. He wrote a whole book on possible worlds. He thinks there are a lot of them, and he thinks the actual world is one of them. And you know what distinguishes it from the other ones? Just one thing.
It's you, right?
You, me, us. It's the actual world. And all the other worlds are actual to its inhabitants, if they have any. Okay. So all the worlds, in Lewis's view, are similar in certain respects. Now, my view is very different from that. Lewis wanted there to be possible worlds because he wanted to give an account of metaphysical possibility and metaphysical necessity. I think also, you should probably see that I'm a somewhat deflationary philosopher. I think that these are 2 big philosophical nightmares, metaphysical.
I'm not understanding. Would you then say that every single set that can be constructed exists if it has a member to that set? Like you said that other possible worlds exist if there are people in them. Like, well, I don't understand.
No. I was speaking the talk of possible worlds. I don't believe in possible worlds like that. I believe in stories that we can tell in our world, but I don't think that there are other possible worlds like Lewis believed. I agree with Lewis on his more or less on his account of laws, not exactly, but I do not agree with his account of metaphysical modality and necessity.
Oh, right. Okay. I see what you're saying.
I don't think he needs it, because he just doesn't really need it for his account of counterfactuals or his account of laws or anything else useful. It just creates headaches for him.
Okay, actually, I said all right. I see what you're saying, but I don't think I do. So, are you saying that Lewis believed possible worlds existed in some sense, and you're saying no, they're just
Yes.
our hypotheticals?
Yes, more or less. That sounds good to me.
So to Lewis, then possible worlds is a misnomer. There's somehow existent worlds that are possible.
Yeah, but that's the right nomer, because they exist, but they're possible, because they're not actual to us. To their inhabitants, they're the actual ones. Actual for him is what he calls indexical.
So Lewis thinks that literally those possible worlds exist as space-time manifolds. So here's one space manifold that we are having this conversation. Now the concrete space-time manifold that's not touching our manifold exists. It's like parallel worlds. They're not touching. They're not like many worlds in Everett, but they are non-interacting parallel worlds out there encompassing.
Okay, let's get to something related, seemingly related, configuration space. So, Eddy, you and I had this conversation off air that you believe the configuration space is too large to be a fundamental arena, and that maybe space-time or whatever is underneath space-time is true or real or more real. So please talk about the distinction between you both and your views of the ontology of configuration space.
Yes. I think there can be lots of developments in future quantum theory, quantum gravity about what is fundamental. But what should be fundamental is some kind of low-dimensional manifold, maybe 20-some dimensions. But it should not be 10 to the billions of billions dimensional configuration space, the space of possible configurations of the particles or the field variables. That space is a huge space. It's hard to recover the ordinary life of tables and chairs, you and me, from that huge space. But it's much more straightforward and to start with a low-dimensional space, respecting all the ordinary symmetries, and recover the manifest image. Now, to do this, we have to think about quantum mechanics in a slightly new way. So there are different interpretation of quantum mechanics, de Broglie-Bohm, GRW, many worlds, but all of them postulate this wave function. And the wave function lives in this high-dimensional configuration space. And to be a realist like us, it's natural to be tempted to be a realist about the wave function and the configuration space it lives on, and take that to be the fundamental space. And everything else is derived, illusory, or something. I think that we should start with the ordinary space and see how can we make sense of quantum mechanics. One way to think the wave function or the quantum state as like a law of nature. So coming back to the question of laws of nature, well, we know that many things we write down as laws, Hamiltonian function, Lagrangian, they also live on a high-dimensional space. They're functions of, say, the classical phase space in classical mechanics. So that is a high-dimensional space too. So if you think of the wave function, the law, encoding some kind of interactions by telling things how to move, then the wave doesn't have to be something concrete, like a particle or a field, but a wave function can be a law of nature telling things how to move. And this tradition of developing this school of thought of nomological interpretation of wave function, that's, I think, facing some of the crucial tasks in whether we can get this to be a simple description. And that's why I kind of depart from the traditional school. I think, okay, maybe we can think about the density matrix, and that's a bit more coarse-grained, and just write simple enough to be a law of nature. And that's the other view I've been developing and thinking about, called the Vantaculus view. The density matrix is a fundamental law of nature, and you can have everything else, ordinary stuff, living in ordinary space-time, or, a more generalized manifold.
Why didn't you call it the Chen calculus?
If someone else calls it,
so we strayed onto another subject matter. And you really want another guest to be debating Eddy on this subject. I can do it because I'm interested in it, but I don't have a firm opinion about this issue, about what the fundamental space and space-time is. But I do understand why someone might think it's a very high-dimensional configuration space. And I don't know who Eddy is to tell reality that it can't have that as its fundamental space. But, Eddy may know better than reality. I don't know. But it might be that that's the best way of systematizing the world. And in fact, I think there's the person I'm thinking about. You know who I'm talking about, Curt?
Jacob Barndas?
David Albert.
Ah.
Okay. So I don't mean, I'm sorry to do this silly guessing game thing. My wife was downstairs. She always wants to whack me over the head for doing that to her. But that's the least of her reasons. So I'd give her that reason. So anyway, there is a dispute within quantum mechanics, but we were almost on another topic, which you didn't quite complete, which is very interesting for you. And that is the nature of metaphysical necessity and metaphysical possibility. And whether you really need the notion of concrete possible worlds, as Lewis called them, what you called realities. You were sort of shocked because you said, you think they really exist? And the reason you said that is because you think exist should be just confined to actually exists. But no, Lewis thought exists has a more general use. It exists in this very general sense, as Eddy explained. Okay. That's what Lewis thought. I don't need that. I don't like that. I don't think the notion of metaphysical possibility and necessity is very useful. The only thing anyone ever used it for any use is to prove the existence of God in a fallacious proof called the ontological proof. But it's not a good notion.
What Barry would move you closer to Eddy's view, and Eddy, what would move you closer to Barry's? Now, Eddy did accept that if God came down and spoke to him, Eddy would change and say, I was wrong about metaphysics. Barry, you said, well, when I was 13, blah, 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 we're going to talk about that off air. So if God can't convince you, Barry, what is it? Like, how movable is your view? How amenable is its evidence?
If I could bring myself to understand what actually could be meant by the laws constraining over and above the laws, the events just satisfying the laws of nature, that would move me. But no one's ever been able to explain it to me. Maybe I'm dense, but no one's ever been able to explain it. Now, in fact, Eddy and I view are much closer together. For example, we have a colleague and friend, Tim Maudlin, another good interviewer. Maybe have you interviewed him?
Several times.
Yeah,
I'll place the links on screen and in the description as well for that.
Okay. So Tim has a view in the Eddy ballpark, but he thinks the laws are just dynamical. They're what he calls floats, fundamental laws of temporal evolution. They take the state of the world at a time and produce subsequent states, and they keep doing the producing. Now, I kind of understand what producing is, except I don't know what laws, how these things called laws can do the producing.
Wait, you understand
I know
producing
how
more than constraining?
It's a good point.
No, I understand what constraining is when I'm constrained to drive, less than 100 kilometers an hour. I understand what that means, okay? But I don't understand what it is for the laws to constrain. That's right. I know what it is for the factory to produce more potato chips, but I don't know what it is for the laws to produce anything. These are metaphors that have gone crazy. Wittgenstein had a nice phrase. Mostly, I don't appeal to Wittgenstein, but I like this phrase of his. He says, "Sometimes language goes on a holiday." This is an example
Well, let
of
me
it.
push back a little bit. Well, so Barry, you're talking about the convergence. I will come back to that. But in terms of the meaning of constraining, or even meaning of production, necessitation on my camp, the non-human camp, where many different views about what laws, how laws govern, I think one can make sense of the primitive in maybe just understanding what a theory says, right? If the theory says you can understand counterfactuals, causation, maybe probabilistic dependencies in terms of the laws, then we somehow implicitly understand the laws, how they constrain. I know that you are going to disagree on the metaphysics, but the metaphysics, the notion of constraining can be understood by how we understand other things, right?
Suppose someone says, "I want to kick it away." Have they kicked away the counterfactuals then?
You get away what? The
Have they,
constraining?
they kick away and say that, you know what? I'm going to do without one day. I'm going to throw away my crutches. I'm going to walk on my own. Do I have to throw away the counterfactuals too?
On my view, yes. Yeah.
No, but not on my view.
I agree.
I don't see why. I understand.
Right.
I understand counterfactuals perfectly well. I don't think you're understanding
Yeah,
counterfactuals any
All
better
right.
than mine.
So I see what you're coming about. Sorry, I did interrupt you, Barry. You were talking about the production versus MIMP and BSA.
Yeah. So among the people who have so-called non-Humean views are the Shelley Goldstein, Eddy Chen view, the Tim Maudlin view, and I referred earlier to David Armstrong and another crew.
And Emily Adlin, for example, too.
Yeah, right. So there are a fair number of people who think they still need the crutch. Okay, it's okay.
Okay.
It's not up to me to take the crutch away. I wouldn't do that. I really don't think anybody would topple over, but if they want to hold on to it, it's okay. All right, but I don't want it. I'm sure I don't need it. So the main difference between the Maudlin view and the Eddy Chen Shelley Goldstein view is that Chen and Goldstein, the laws constrain all of reality. It's sort of a sense all at once. Now it's a bad metaphor because it's not at once. It's
that temporal notion. Right.
Mm-hmm. Timeless. It's timeless. Yes. Whereas on Maudlin's view, time comes into the story very centrally, very important. He has to have time as a primitive notion as well. Eddy doesn't have to have it. He may want it. I don't think so, but he may want it. I don't want it. I know I don't want it. So time is not primitive to me. I think I can give an account of what time is in terms of my general scheme. But
you mean time's direction, right?
Time's direction. Yes. Well, I think time is in systematizing the world. We want to come up with the best systematization of the world as we see around us, and we see our world in space and time. Mm-hmm. We may modify our conceptions of space and time. Whoever would have thought that the things that can happen that are not simultaneous with each other, or no one coming before the other.
That's true.
But yeah, so we've changed our mind about exactly Einstein changed people's minds about, or some people's minds about, actually, this is, people still argue over this, and it's a funny way. I'm going to get into that, but
sure,
it's okay. So I think we start with Wilfrid Sellars, another hero of mine's philosopher. You can't interview him yet anymore either. He liked to use the phrase the manifest image of the world and the scientific image of the world. We start with the manifest image of the world, the way the world appears to us when we start moving around in it. We develop a vocabulary for talking about it in terms of macroscopic objects, in terms of mental, items that we talk about in terms of there being stars and planets and clouds and weather and rain and plants and so on. And we notice that these seem to be a system that plants grow bigger and then they die. Well, that happens to my kitten too, and to human beings too. There must be something in common about all of this. What could that be? Okay, well, it took a lot of discovery to come up with a decent account. I mean, I'm not sure it's quite done yet, but it all ultimately boils down to what we were calling before the second law of nature. And I don't mean to oversimplify, but that's a big part of it. That unifies all of these processes. So that's what I think is involved in what explaining is and what laws do. So you got to have the manifest image and the scientific image. And Wilfrid Sellars said the biggest job for philosophy in the 20th and 21st century is to reconcile the manifest and the scientific image.
I think I completely agree, Barry. I think this is something that...
I sure you would. How would you not?
Yeah.
Okay, sure, of course. But what I'm saying is that we're starting with the manifest image. That's enough for us to have as rebuilding the ship at sea. We don't need an ontological.
Epistemologically, yes, I agree. But ontologically,
ontologically, all we got was reality. We don't need an additional crutch. We don't need there being these primitive laws. We don't need there being primitive laws of temporal evolution. We don't need there being primitive constraints. We don't need there being a human mosaic. Okay, we just need reality.
So when I was asking about, Barry, what would move you closer to Eddy, you'd said it would be to understand what it means to constrain over and above satisfying. Now, when I speak to people who are not libertarian free will people and are more on the compatibilist end, actually, they aren't even compatibilist, they would say free will is a meaningless concept. I don't even know what it means. So usually people don't buy into something not because they disagree, but they don't even know what that position means. I know you have several papers on free will, Barry, so I'll link to them on screen right now. Now, Eddy, I'm going to ask you to explain what it means to help Barry along. And hopefully, Barry, you'll say, okay, I get that now. I'm understanding. Still don't agree, but I'm understanding more your position, Eddy. But I'm also curious, if there aren't constraints, then are we free in your view, Barry? And does free will have anything to do with that? Or are you...
asking Eddy, or you're asking me?
No, I'm asking you about free will now. Because if you don't believe in constraints...
So you'll be happy to know that I've written papers on free will, which I'll be happy to send you. I have views about that as well. And I think the important thing here is a philosophical point, and that is that many concepts that we inherit from our ancestors just aren't quite right. They need to be modified. Now, sometimes they just need to be jettisoned completely. There are concepts like that. Maybe, think about the ether, or whatever they call it, the ether. Should it have been jettisoned, or should it be identified with a field? I don't know. Probably jettisoned. Okay. But free will, I think we want to keep. Causation is a great example. I think what people think about causation is very screwed up, needs to be modified. Bertrand Russell, the great quoter, he said, what did he say about causation? He said, causation is like the British monarchy. People keep it around because it's mistakenly thought to do no harm.
Okay.
That's what Russell said. Now, I don't agree with Russell. I think we need the notion of causation, but it's not primitive. It's not fundamental. It's going to fit into my general overall account, and I do fit it in to my general overall account via the notions of counterfactuals and correlations and stuff like that. Okay, so I think there is something like free will, but I'm more in the school of what you'd call a compatibilist. I think there are fundamental laws of physics. A friend of mine, another good interview, Janan Ismail.
Yes, I'm speaking with her shortly.
Oh, great. Okay. She wrote a book called How the Laws of Physics Make Us Free.
Right.
When she told me the title, I thought she said, "How the Laws of Physics Make Us Flee." I was just remembering her physics classes, but no, how they make us free. Because in fact, and I agree with her, that the laws of physics contain within it the secret for how to make for compatibilism. And we could do a whole session on that if you wanted to sometime. Jenna and I don't have exactly the same views about that, but we both agree about being compatible. So I think that there is a distinction between doing something free and doing something under constraint. But there, I mean a real constraint, where somebody's going to shoot me in the head or do something else to me if I don't do what they say I should do. That's a real constraint. I don't think anyone's going to shoot a particle in the head if it doesn't move in accordance with F equals ma.
Okay. So, Eddy, firstly, I'm curious about your view on free will since we're on that subject. And then also, it would be great to explain the difference between constraining and satisfying.
Yeah. So on the constraint and satisfying question, I think that gets to the heart of the debate between humanism and non-humanism. And one of the motivation Sheldon Goldston and I had when writing the paper, developing the view, was to really sharpen the disagreement. And when it's jettison production with temporal evolution with time's direction, then it looks like really we are at a case where the only difference is between whether you have this notion that's playing a metaphysical role only or just a semantic role of making truth conditions. And for us, it's a metaphysical role. And it's hard to kind of give a knockdown argument for this view, but it's just something that we think is very natural given how we do science, very natural how we think about, explanations and grounding counterfactuals in science. And we can give axioms, say, if something constrains something else, so if the law L constrains mosaic M, then M satisfies the law L. But besides that, since it is a primitive, we cannot explain this in more illuminating fashion by appealing to other more fundamental, more primitive notions. So if someone understands our view, they see what we're saying. If someone says, well, we don't accept the view, we cannot convince them by saying, okay, here is a primitive, and you have to accept the primitive. That's not going to be convincing either. But I do think that a lot of scientific practice, and think about theories and models and how laws explain, they don't fit into the Humean picture. A lot of cases when we think about, for example, a simple example, a Newtonian particle just flying around in one straight line in empty space. No forces on it, so straight line. So 3 kilometers per second. And that universe, this universe by itself, is compatible with Newtonian laws, is compatible with the law that everything moves in this velocity and forever. And for us, we think that both are possible laws given the same universe, but the Humean would deny that. So that's kind of one test case where we think, okay, yeah, in scientific modeling, in scientific testing, we have this kind of non-supervenience intuition we're trying to capture for the laws of nature. And so we are non-Humean.
Yeah, the intuition. But have you done the test?
Okay, I know that, Barry, you disagree on the notion intuition and testing intuition. Okay.
Of course, you can't not done the test. So don't make it sound like when you use we, be careful about the royal we here. I'm not.
We're thinking about the conceptual test, broadly construed. We're trying to think about a conceptual framework to accommodate what we think to be laws.
I disagree with you. You get into a discussion with a physicist, they get all confused, and many of them want to be Humeans. They just can't abide your notions of constraint the way you want to understand it. That's my experience with physicists.
Somehow my experience is the opposite from that. But that's okay.
Well, of course. I do want to relay a story, though, which probably is helpful here. I was once in another debate with another philosopher who sort of started out somewhat in Eddy's camp, not the same view exactly, a different version of it. And we stayed up all night at a hotel in Geneva, I think. And we were arguing about this stuff. And then I went back to the United States. The next thing I knew, he not only became a Humean, he became what he called a super-Humean. At first, I thought it was just to embarrass me. But no, he was serious. Now, his view is no good, too. So I'm not going to get into it. Okay. But so I'm not a super-Humean. And I'm not a Humean either. I'm a package deal guy. Okay. But I do think that's an amusing story about convincing people when you're in a debate with somebody. I don't really think I'm going to convince Eddy.
On this point, I want to come back to maybe an earlier question Curt asked, which is what
Please.
would move me to closer to humanism? I'm always very sympathetic to humanism. I learned humanism from Barry and from Dave and others, and I kind of one of my first papers was defending humanism against quantum entanglement and this wave function thing that's too high-dimensional, how to make it reconcile with the null-dimensional mosaic and its density matrix. I do think that non-humans have a lot to learn from humans because they constantly jettison all the crutches we seem to rely on, production, times direction, and so on. Of course, we disagree on the fundamentals. We're going to want to hold on to the primitive notions of, they say, laws or the relation of governing. But there's a flexibility in humanism that's making this a very illuminating view that I always try to put my human head on and think about a question, and put my non-human head on and think about a question, and see if am I appealing to intuitions that may be extraneous to the question at hand. And I sometimes feel whenever I'm appealing to intuitions that are in common. So I know Bear doesn't like the word intuition, but think about considerations in common to humanism and non-humanism, and then work out a solution. Somehow it's more robust solution. I think as one example of current joint work with Jeffrey Barrett at UC Irvine, we're thinking about probabilities as constraints that are getting very, very close to certain human views of laws and probabilities. They're kind of implicit and maybe not quite precise, but when we make sense of them in a precise way we want in terms of algorithm randomness, then things become very much neutral between humanism and non-humanism. And that's, I think, how metaphysics of laws, metaphysics of science should proceed, is to find the common ground and to solve problems in light of the common ground and see if you can transfer back to the different views. But of course, there'll be ultimate disagreements about the metaphysics status of the solutions. But I think I'm always drawn to the neutral ground between humanism and non-humanism. And MIMP is a byproduct in the sense that when I think about the various non-human views in literature, when I talk with Sheldon Goldstein, we realize there's a lot of baggage we have on non-human views, whereas human views naturally grab to the baggage-free account. It's too lean. We don't want to that lean, so we want some kind of structures.
The rat baggage-free account, yeah.
And that's how we came to MIMP.
Well, I have structures too. And who can reject common ground? I'm all in favor of common ground too. Okay. But we should sharpen our disagreement. I think bringing into the discussion, not about what physicists should do, we don't disagree about that, and not about how they should practice. We don't disagree about that, I guess. We might, in places, disagree with, unless they disagree with among themselves. What we do is we disagree about, as you said, the metaphysics of laws. I have the view that we can give an account of what laws are, not what the laws are, but what laws are, without bringing in notions like constraint as a fundamental, or notions like temporal evolution as the fundamental, or notion like production as a fundamental. I think we can give an account of that. Now, we, of course, do have some basic axioms and basic thoughts or basic concepts. Everybody does. And we start, and I don't think you really reject them, because in the end of the day, you want to have the same unification view I have. It's not like your view. What would you say if God said, there are a lot of constraints, but they're incredibly complicated, and so complicated. In fact, it's not complicated. There's another God. He says, there's just one constraint. The constraint is that Eddy never gives up non-humanism. That's the constraint. Everything else, there's no law. It just,
well, Barry, that can happen on human views too, on your view too. If the mosaic so vast and so huge and so many levels, we have access to only what's in front of us, the macroscopic domain.
Yeah, but I don't believe in the mosaic. I don't believe in the mosaic.
Yeah.
So
reality, let's say reality, has a lot of... Reality is huge and has lots of facts We have access.
We can agree on that.
At most 1% of all the facts. Okay, that is generous, right? So
Yes,
in that case, we have lots of epistemic limitations of physical reality. This is even beyond the metaphysics laws. It's like, suppose you have package deal account or the best system account or minimal primitivism account, then we postulate the physical reality what we want, but we have to acknowledge that we don't fully access the physical reality. So the kind of cases you have in mind that we are systematically wrong about physical reality can happen regardless of the metaphysical laws.
Absolutely, because I completely agree with that. Nothing about my view that says
right.
But
you're saying this is like some special problem for minimal primitivism.
No. I didn't. I made perfectly clear. I don't think your view is incoherent. There's no logical contradiction in your view. There is, for me, a kind of like understanding problem in understanding what constraint can really amount to, other than the metaphor that's left over from the Descartes' idea of the laws being enforced by God. But you may have something in mind, and if so, more power to you. I just don't think scientists really need this crutch. And the scientists can pick and choose their philosophies of science. They will go about doing science the same way, whether they go for me or for you about this, as you say, and that's right. So this is a philosophical dispute. And like people often say, philosophical disputes are the most useless in a certain way. But in another way, they're not useless because we understand things better when we have a discussion like this. Understand what different views are. Right?
Yeah, I do think that is it can be fruitful philosophically too, and scientifically thinking about non-humanism, minimal-primitivism, and constraints, because you are really at this level you have to, if you only think of probability, for example, then there will be theoretical pressure to think of them in a way that leads you to certain views and not others. And that can make a difference in
like comprehensiveness, simplicity. Yeah.
Right. How do you cash out comprehensiveness, simplicity, how you cash out probabilistic laws in general, right. How you think about the principle, how connection between credences happen to chance. All of this.
Very important. Oh, very important.
So,
because I go along with all of that.
When you sharpen a disagreement, I think there's going to be convergence of the views, but also there's going to be open questions on how we feel out the details of various views. Perhaps you have feel out the details for package deal account, but on primitivism, there are a lot of questions about probabilities and chances and credences that are going to get very exciting and open questions.
Yeah, well, Lewis himself, speaking for Lewis's view, Lewis addressed how probability fits into his account, into the best systematization account. And it's been written about a bit by me, among other people, and trying to explain what Lewis was up to. Because Lewis thought that one way of systematizing, maybe you might notice this because you brought up Kolmogorov complexity earlier. Take a long sequence of H, T, H, T, H, T, 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 H, T, 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 T. It goes on for a long time. You might say, what a headache. How can I systematize that? But then you notice that in any segment of 20 or 30, you get about 10 or 15 heads. Furthermore, if you just were to pick them out in that group, just pick them out, so to speak. I'm going to use the phrase at random, but you know what I really mean because we're talking about algorithms here. We just pick them out. We'll also discover that there'll be, unless we pick them out according to the rule, just pick out H's or pick out T's or something like that. We'll also, as long as we don't use a rule like that, we'll also get about half. And that indicates that these are what one might say independent events, each with probability 1/2. And that gives a lot of information about that sequence. It tells you what degree of belief to have in any big, long sequence. It tells you if you had a sequence of 100 of them, your degree of belief should be just about one that you get between 48 and 52 H's. You won't go wrong with that. Eddy disparaged my account of things by calling them merely semantic earlier. In my view, counterfactuals are merely semantic. because the account of counterfactuals connects them up with other things. My account of laws is merely semantic. It's word merely semantic. I have a question for Eddy. Is money merely semantic? When you go to the bank, do you say, "Can you give me a little semantic, please?" No, it's not merely semantic. Money is not merely semantic. Merely semantic hides a lot. It's a term that we've created in order to characterize an aspect of reality. So reality comes into the story too, both in money in a complicated way. That's what I'm going to go into, and with laws and objective probability.
So, speaking of semantic, I want to linger here, Barry, with you, please. And then I would like to hear, Eddy, your view as well about how philosophical disputes can be both useless and fruitful. And the reason is that many of the people who are watching, the audience comprises faculty in computer science, math, physics, and philosophy, and also a general audience.
I've been among them.
And they will both be frustrated and enriched. So they'll feel like, okay, this is just quibbling over semantics, like you mentioned. They'll feel like maybe this is just going in circles. Yet at the same time, they're still watching 2 hours later. And if you were to ask them, they'd say, actually, I feel somehow enriched by this. I feel like I understand something deeper. And I feel like my eyes are opening slightly, but I can't quite pinpoint why. So
That's an excellent question. So it's a very good and thought-provoking question. It's really good. So what I think is this. I definitely know that there are useless disputes in philosophy for me. I can give an example of one in a minute, and I'll probably give an example of many. This is not one of them, although it's a used-up dispute to some extent. I'm not sure there's going to be much new on the horizon after the package deal account, but who knows what other people come up with. I didn't think I would come up with that. So it's not useless, but it might be used up. Okay, now here's the useless one. Maybe you've interviewed some of the people about it. Some people have argued of how many objects are there in this bowl. Well, you have a bowl. There's a ball bobbing up and down in the water. Is there one object, the ball? Two objects, the ball and the water. Or a lot of objects, because they're all the molecules. Or maybe many more objects, because they're all the photons. And many, many more, all the particles. I think this is completely useless, the how many objects dispute. But grown philosophers have banged their heads against the wall about it. And some have thought it's useless, but it is useless. On the other hand, the issue between so-called Humeanism and non-Humeanism, it was useful to me because it caused me to come up with the package deal account, which I think is a better deal. So it's useful to me. I know, of course, people can say individually what's useful to them.
That's a very deep question. So I'm thinking about how do you, just speaking from my experiences, I think that in thinking about the intellectual history of laws of nature, for example, and problems of induction, Hume's problem, Goemon's problem, and contemporary debates about the future of physics, foundations of quantum mechanics, foundations of statistical mechanics, all of these things get intertwined. Can we make sense of probability is tied to can we make sense of entropy? What kind of entropy is it? Is it Boltzmann entropy, Gibbs entropy, von Neumann entropy? And then how to make sense of laws is tied to how to make sense of the wave function and quantum state, and also the basic mosaic structure. Is it high-dimensional structure or low-dimensional structure? So many things are at stake. And I think the convergence of views or the convergence of clarification of disagreements should sharpen those arguments, give us some kind of fixed point to refer back to. That if we disagree about this, it means we may be disagreeing about this too. So it's traced back to this fundamental disagreement about what laws are, what probabilities are, what explanations are. And if there are no scientific difference between, say, Barry's view and my view when we come to scientific practice, we can rest a bit more assured that the differences in those fundamental notions don't kind of percolate up to differences how we think about foundations of physics. And that could be reassuring because we can just think about differences will be traced back to something else, maybe scientific differences, empirical differences, but not to the conceptual difference between what laws are.
That's a really good point, Eddy. Do you know of any? You gave an intuition before, but that's not the same thing.
Case of what? Example of what?
Of a scientific claim, an experiment that could be done, which could tell the difference between your view and my view.
I don't think there is an experiment.
I don't either.
Right.
But I think in answer to your question, that's why I thought it was a really good question. I don't think there's any practical difference between our views, which is why I think you could say we don't need the crutch.
I think you can be agnostic about the existence of crutch, but not say there is no crutch or there is crutch based on just practice and empirical experiences. And that's the kind of more a conservative inference from that. I just want to continue this thought, if I may, with Curt. So regarding laws of nature, this seems like a very historical debate going back to hundreds of years. But if you think about the contemporary developments of machine learning or AI, there are many side effects of this are really harmful, and we have to be careful. But one of the marvelous achievement is that AI has become really good at picking up some patterns, simple patterns that are informative across the board, not just on training data, but also across test data. So you can see new things and you can still perform well. What is that? It's a form of induction. And what is the ground for that induction? Well, some people say, well, some kind of uniformity principle, some kind of things happen in the same way over and over again. And we know that's not true because nature is not uniform. What is really underlying all of that is this kind of simple, informative laws of nature that can be uniform in some cases, maybe not be uniform in all cases, but this is a manifestation of laws of nature give rise to effective descriptions. They're still very lawful. And I think so all these achievements in AI can be thought as a foundational way as connecting back to these conceptual questions of laws of nature, how they relate to induction and explanation, and what is different between pure prediction and understanding.
Well, of course, I partly agree with a lot of that. Where I disagree is I don't think you need the crutch. I do think that nature is uniform in some respects and not uniform in other respects. My guess is you agree with that.
Right.
And what science is looking for the uniformity in the right respects. And that's what these AI programs are constructed to try to build too. And they've gotten pretty good at it in certain areas. So if we're interested, I know with some programs, for example, in finding patterns of chemical recombination, they're good at doing that because they start out with a vocabulary of chemical recombination, given a lot of examples. They're trained maybe by using Monte Carlo methods, things like that, and they are able then to get better at recognizing patterns, the right patterns, the patterns that satisfy certain criteria.
Yeah,
but you don't need a crutch to guarantee those guarantees.
Good. So but the kind of implicit biases, the inductive biases here are very implicit, and I'm not saying this is an argument for non-humanism over humanism. It's saying that it brings together questions about metaphysics of laws and epistemology of laws with contemporary practice in machine learning. There are lots of open questions here, understanding why AI is working so well. And it seems like when we don't build in something explicit by hand, it's a transformer model, still they're doing really well on things they have not been trained on. And that's a miracle. It kind of goes back to the marvel of the universe, that why is the universe just in general so nice to us that we can discover so much from so little?
So it seems. Now, I also distinguish epistemology from metaphysics. But you're right that my metaphysics is a closer friend to my epistemology. And people who have view like yours always have a big problem make friendship up between epistemology and metaphysics. Okay. But my metaphysics starts out already by nature friendly to epistemology.
I think there is going to be the same gap on your view on metaphysics, epistemology, just as on minimal primitivism. We have to postulate similar kind of epistemological principles that connect our evidence to physical reality. It's a big inference, big jump. There's no guarantee.
We do, of course.
There's no probabilistic bias.
Well, I'm glad we agree that there's no guarantee. That's surely my bottom watchword. I never give a guarantee.
But you said closer.
I
Well,
never
in what sense is closer? The epistemology and metaphysics.
Well, I think it's guaranteed. But I think as the history has shown, it looks like it's gotten better and better and better. Maybe we're wrong. Maybe
No.
some
So is there a difference between MINP and your view of laws, a package deal account, that brings the epistemology closer to the metaphysics? That given the metaphysics, we're more likely to be successful in the limit of inquiry in science on your account?
And MINP is minimal primitivism. Use the word MINP, which is something that we know, but the audience doesn't know. Minimal primitivism.
That's his view.
Yeah, minimal primitivism versus package deal account.
Right. So Eddy didn't come up with this catchy name like I did. I'm very good at naming. If you want, I'll sell you a name, Eddy. So
Mentaculous.
Mentacular. Well, it's not mine originally, but we're not going to get into that. You can do another session if you want. You can do that one with Ethan Cohn if you want, actually.
Sure. My favorite film is No Country. There's two: No Country for Old Men and There Will Be Blood. Both released in the same year.
They're great movies. But Serious Man is where that term comes from, and that's also a good movie for a physicist, especially.
Mm-hmm.
So
okay, I'd like to end with a question to both of you that's more human, not humanism, not human. Clearly, you have different views. And I want to know what it's like, Barry, to teach and guide someone, because you were Eddy's PhD supervisor, for those who just skipped forward and didn't watch the introduction. So what is it like? Do you try to foster that tension? Or do you try to convince your student that their dissent must stem from a misunderstanding, because obviously you know what you're talking about and the student is new?
No, but I don't think that. But the first thing about Eddy is, if there ever was a self-motivated student, a self-motivated philosopher, Eddy is it. He's much more motivated than I was at his stage, and much more accomplished than I was at his stage. So he has motivation all over the place. He's very well motivated. He knew what he wanted to think about. Now, it's true he developed his view with a colleague of ours, Shelley Goldstein, who's a mathematician. I don't think Shelley believes the view with the same fervor that you do from my conversations with him, but I'm not sure. Shelley may show deference to me about these philosophical matters. I'm not sure. But as far as teaching Eddy, well, I had him in classes, and I interacted with his dissertation, but he really motivated what he was doing. And he had a co-director, and he knew exactly what he was doing. He knows exactly what he's doing today. So it was no problem. The problem I have is with students who are not motivated. I do have some students like that, and it's so hard to get them to get. They're just worried that that's not right, and doing right. Eddy just decided a view, and he wants to defend it. I think that's great.
Now, Eddy, how is it that you didn't succumb to, because you're a student, to just believing or conceding to whatever your elder wants, and your elder holds your academic fate? Well, I mean, you hold, in some sense, the future of Eddy in your hands. So Eddy, tell me about that process, what it's like to still retain your original point of view, maybe even sharpen it or increase that divide with your supervisor.
So it was a very, very special environment for me when I was doing PhD at Rutgers, interacting with Barry and David Albert, my co-supervisors, and Sheldon Goldstein in the math department, Tim, and other Roddy Tomolka, and people at Princeton and CUNY. It's a very diverse intellectual environment. And I felt very, attracted to Barry's view at first. And I tried to read everything and understand everything from the inside out. And I think for a few years, I was a Humean. For a few years, I believe in even the high-dimensional view. But I realized, there are arguments for or against, and I wasn't quite sure if my arguments were so worked out. So it's during those years I tried to develop my own views, trying to defend those views, and trying to work out, what I should think about laws and quantum mechanics and probability. I never knew I would write on laws of nature because I know it's hard and it's a deep issue. And for this discussions, it's very hard to resolve them by empirical experiments, right? You cannot do experiment to test them. So all of this boiled down to some kind of the central arguments that really are hard to resolve. But I realized when I tried to develop my views on quantum mechanics, I had to say something about statistical mechanics and the past hypothesis, and then laws of nature and vagueness, and everything come together into one thing. So I realized later on that I'm a non-Humean. And I had this non-Humean inclination anyways, and try to develop view as scientifically motivated as can be, and also as minimal as can be. But
I gave you the minimalism.
you gave the minimalism, and you gave me the encouragement to develop this too, and all the best arguments and objections. I think what really helped me was all these objections from Barry and David on anything I say. Which really helped me to train an ear for questions and things I should watch out for in writing papers.
Yes, the criticism is a blessing and a curse, because in the moment you don't like it, but then even when you're on your own, at least for me, as soon as I have a thought, I play out all the criticisms from different figures in my head.
Yeah, that's very helpful. It sometimes can be paralyzing, but sometimes, because Barry is so nice, the objections and questions you raise are just very wonderful and helpful.
So, Eddy, it sounds like you had a on the road to Damascus moment. You started out as a Humean, you're on the road to Damascus. Let me tell you, it's always possible to come back.
To the darker side.
Good. Okay. But at least you didn't become a superhuman. That would have been a disgrace.
That's an interesting view too. The view that Michael Asfeld is developing. I think all of these views are, it's like sometimes they're like almost logical extremes, but you can see, even though you disagree with them, there are things you can kind of incorporate into your own views. Like, what is the minimal structure of space and time? What is relations you need to build a theory of everything?
So, Curt, do you like philosophical musicals?
Musicals? I don't think I like regular musicals.
Well, I don't. What about Gilbert and Sullivan? Gilbert and Sullivan?
I don't think so, no.
Well, I was in Gilbert and Sullivan when I was in the 6th grade, so I remember the HMS Pinafore. So I said I like Gilbert and Sullivan, but I'm thinking that we could have a philosophical Humean saying that everyone is born a little Humean or a little non-Humean. I'm not going to break out into song because then your audience will flee as fast as they could go. But that's what it sounds like to me. It's sort of Gilbert and Sullivan.
I appreciate you both spending so long with me. Thank you so much, Barry and Eddy.
It's great talking with you, Curt, and hopefully we can meet in person someday.
Dude, you're a cool guy. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you.
I like your channel a lot. Very, very rare to see someone engage so deeply with philosophy, with physics, with everything.
New update. Started a Substack. Writings on there are currently about language and ill-defined concepts, as well as some other mathematical details. Much more being written there. This is content that isn't anywhere else. It's not on Theories of Everything. It's not on Patreon. Also, full transcripts will be placed there at some point in the future. Several people ask me, hey Curt, you've spoken to so many people in the fields of theoretical physics, philosophy, and consciousness. What are your thoughts? While I remain impartial in interviews, this Substack is a way to peer into my present deliberations on these topics. Also, thank you to our partner, The Economist. Firstly, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. If you haven't subscribed or clicked that like button, now is the time to do so. Why? Because each subscribe, each like helps YouTube push this content to more people like yourself. Plus, it helps out Curt directly, aka me. I also found out last year that external links count plenty toward the algorithm, which means that whenever you share on Twitter, say on Facebook, or even on Reddit, etc., it shows YouTube, hey, people are talking about this content outside of YouTube, which in turn greatly aids the distribution on YouTube. Thirdly, you should know this podcast is on iTunes, it's on Spotify, it's on all of the audio platforms. All you have to do is type in Theories of Everything and you'll find it. Personally, I gained from rewatching lectures and podcasts. I also read in the comments that, hey, Toll listeners also gain from replaying. So how about instead you re-listen on those platforms like iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, whichever podcast catcher you use. And finally, if you'd like to support more conversations like this, more content like this, then do consider visiting patreon.com/Curt Jaimungal and donating with whatever you like. There's also PayPal, there's also crypto, there's also just joining on YouTube. Again, keep in mind, it's support from the sponsors and you that allow me to work on TOE full-time. You also get early access to ad-free episodes, whether it's audio or video. It's audio in the case of Patreon, video in the case of YouTube. For instance, this episode that you're listening to right now was released a few days earlier. Every dollar helps far more than you think. Either way, your viewership is generosity enough. Thank you so much.